Yes, I am.
Hey,
Sorry for the
okay.
delay.
Good deal. Well, welcome. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? And I don't
Okay.
want to do any big introduction here. Well, my name is Doug Kruse, Rutgers University, and we've got three great, interesting papers here. The first one will be by Ting Ran at Peking University on ICT use, cognitive and non-cognitive abilities and wages, microevidence from China.
And Doug, you might want to hit mute all, and then except for Ting.
Yeah. Right.
Could you see the my slides?
Currently,
We can see a list of files.
Could you see the my slides?
We can see a list of files here.
A list of files, not
Looks like
the
there's
one.
a PowerPoint at the top.
Is this one?
Yeah, there we go.
So you see the size, right? Okay. Okay. So this is our empirical paper looking at the wage determination from cognitive and non-cognitive abilities, and also the indirect effect from ICT use. Actually, the topic we just talked about, how this prevalence of ICT use, this may also influence the wage determination. Because before we have like this human capital theory, seems like predict wages well. But more recently, we also see the rising use of ICT. Doctors mentioned a very high percentage in the US, especially for now. In China, the number also has been rising using these ICT technologies. So the present study is to use a micro, a survey data from China, looking at these family and labor issues, and we also capture the measures for cognitive and non-cognitive abilities together to predict wages. In our study, it's more like wage incomes. And also we can have the information about how these individuals, whether they use ICT or not in their workplace, social, and some other contexts. With the combination of these two streams of information, so we can run a wage equation to look at how these factors, they may influence the wage determination. So this is the overall setup. Basically, we want to add some evidence to the current literature to look at the effects. In labor economics, the cognitive and non-cognitive abilities has been brought into the picture, I think mostly by the Professor James Heckman in early 2000s. They have been like writing pieces of papers, try to look at these effects, right, in the labor market outcomes. If you look at the trend in China.
Ting, could I just ask, could you go full screen on your PowerPoint?
Oh, this is not, okay. Let me see the full screen. It's here. It's here, right? Okay.
Great, perfect, thank you.
Right. So if you look at this prevalence of ICT use in China, so growing from 2007, it's about 2 million of about like 1.34 billion population, all the way to 2016, it's about 700 million. 200 million all the way to 700 million, so which is about half of the population. For now, it's about like 1.4 billion based on the statistical yearbook. So which means it's a very kind of a strong effect on the society, also in the workplace. From the theoretical perspective, early on, there is almost no discussion about these individual abilities, right, in determining wages. And then later, there are like empirical studies starting from the 1990s, look at this effect from cognitive abilities on labor market outcomes, especially in the US. So this become an important human component in the human capital theory, so that we kind of know there are individual differences across this labor force. And also later on, non-cognitive abilities such as like personality, like some motivation, like social skills, also being brought on board to look at the wage determination, like 2006 Heckman Oz paper, etc. ICT use also about the same time. There are scholars to look at ICT use individually influence this wage determination, like in 1993 Kruger's paper. But some other papers they criticize, so this kind of study by program may not actually observe all the unobservable heterogeneities. However, follow-up studies has been strengthened the idea that ICT may use itself may independently influence wage determination, not because the endogeneity issue, like influencing cognitivity influence the use of ICT, etc. There's some argument that this ICT use may be skill bias technology, which may enlarge the wage gap between skilled workers and non-skilled workers, simply because skilled workers tend to be a higher cognitive ability people tend to use this kind high skill more, which enlarge the wage gap. So that's very likely issue. In our some other studies, we also see the kind of the trend of enlarging this wage gap because of this wage bias influence from a higher technology. So this is the overall theoretical background for this empirical study. So basically, we put forth a few hypotheses. The first two are quite straightforward, look at the effects of cognitive and non-cognitive abilities on wages. And the third one is look at the ICT use independently influenced wages. And the fourth and the fifth one look at the interaction effects between these two kind of abilities and ICT use. We try to perceive these two concepts, abilities versus ICT use, the orthogonal factors. So these are the hypotheses. And the so-called moderating effect, basically we try to see whether ICT use complements the determination from individuals' differences in their abilities. The data is so-called the Chinese family panel data, panel studies, which is a longitudinal survey, try to follow up individuals across years. It's a representative survey, arguably covering 25 provinces and regions and 95% of the national populations, conducted by Peking University. The lead author for the current project is Yu Xie. Yu Xie was a Michigan University Michigan statistician, also fellow of the U.S. Academy of Arts and Science. He has been doing these applying these statistical methods in the large scale social surveys. The surveys is probably like similar to the CGSS kind of survey in the U.S. in University of Michigan. So we used the early waves of this survey in 2010 and 2014. They kind of match pairs between these two waves, meaning the surveyor, they try to follow those individuals across these two waves. They ask a bunch of questions, including this kind of wage determination and also ICT use. We can match up about 5,000 of these individuals across these 2 years, but put together for this two-wave survey, we have like 10,574 observations, cross-sectionally using these two-wave data. So we define dependent variable, independent variable. The main dependent variable is log wage. So basically, these are all the income from different kind of wages reported by the individual. So we do the log form. And for independent variables, we define the cognitive abilities because the survey includes two sets of cognitive ability questions. One is a literacy test. The other one is a math test. Basically, they have like 24 Chinese characters from easy to difficult, because Chinese characters tend to be very difficult to like literacy. So the interviewee will show their recognition of these 24 Chinese characters, and then they count the number being correct. Also, math, the numerical test is also like 34 math problems, like the person the surveyor will bring the question to the interviewee to solve, and then they put up the number, the correct. as a measure for the numerical test. So these are the two sets of tests, and we use that to run like a principal component analysis and try to measure, give one value for this countability variable. The non-countabilities are like 5 dimensional questions from 1 to 7 Likert scale to let the interviewer to evaluate the interviewee's performance across these 5 dimensions, like the expression, courteousness, cooperation, reliability, comprehension, something, all these related to measure that. And then we have these 2 independent variables. The ICT use is is a scale to ask the interviewees how often they use this ICT technology, in different settings. However, eventually the data is constructed as a dichotomous variable. So basically, it's whether or not a interviewee will use internet in their work or study, social, or entertainment. So become a dichotomous variable. You can see from the screen that in 2010, based on the survey, it's a around 30% rate for these individuals using ICT technology at work. But in 2014, it's about 40%. But in the last screen, we can see the coverage of ICT is about 50% in 2016 in China. So there's this slight discrepancy between whether you use or the coverage, by the facility infrastructure. So there's a slight difference. There may be a coverage already in the region, in the area, but the individual may not have to use that in their particular context, like social and workplace context. So these are the key variables. Basically, we run a main search equation, kind of form of equation to look at countability, non-countability, internet use, and also interaction, among these 3, and controlling for a bunch of individual fixed effects. And because it's cross-sectional data, so it's basically control for various factors in the equation, like individuals and some regional fixed effects, etc. So then we look at the effect of these factors. So these are the main effects. We standardize the cognitive measures and non-cognitive measures. Basically from the column 1 is a test for hypothesis 1. So we see the cognitive ability has a positive significant effect on wage determination. From the column 2, we can see here, the non-cognitive ability also has a positive effect on the log wage. Column 3, we see ICT use itself is a positive factor determining wage, separate from cognitive and non-cognitive abilities. 4 and 5 are the interaction between, 4 is lump these 3 together, and we see the previous factors mostly remain, except for reduced significance for non-cognitive abilities. 5th column, look at the last 2 interaction terms. We see that cognitive ability with ICT, we see the positive effect, and also positive effect for non-cognitive abilities. This kind of suggests the complementary effects between ICT and cognitive and non-cognitive abilities. So the total sample is about 10,000, and also the R square is about 25%-ish. Seems like, considering the large data, it seems like it's quite well predicted. So these are the main effects. So basically, we can see the complementary, from the ICT. And then we look at the sample into female and male. We have some other factors, results here. I just want to, report the gender differences. So this is for female, and table 7 is for male. The main effects are similar. So meaning cognitive and non-cognitive ICT use or independently predict wages. If you look at the interaction term for the 5th column on these 2 tables, it seems like for female group, about 4,000 female, we see the interaction term is more significant in the interaction between non-cognitive abilities and ICT use. But for male, it's more on the cognitive abilities and ICT use, not much on non-cognitive abilities. So it seems like for ICT facilitates in different ways For female, it tends to facilitate the non-cognitive abilities in determining wage, which means help to improve their wages. But for male, then the effects more on cognitive ability side. So these are the overall findings. So if we say there is like technology bias effect from using this ICT, for male it's more obvious. But it seems that it's not quite relevant to see the technology bias effect. If you're thinking about the cognitive abilities that may lead to a person to use higher level technology more often, but it's not that obvious in female. We don't know whether it's because female tend, in the current setting in the Chinese particular survey, it's those female interviewees tend not to use as high, or it's because it's not that relevant, to them, because social skill is probably more important for female in the workplace when they combine abilities and facilitation from ICT. So these kinds of our thought on the findings. So briefly conclude that we do see, kind of confirm the previous studies to see the effects from cognitive abilities on wages. We see the influence from ICT on wages, and also we see the kind of differences across genders. We see the complementary, between the ICT's facilitating abilities on wages. So that's kind of overall findings for this empirical study. Back to you, Doug.
Thank you very much. That's great. I should have mentioned that people are free to either submit questions using the chat function, or we will have hopefully about 15 minutes at the end where you can ask questions directly. I was going to say face-to-face, but see the person's face, but this isn't exactly what we call face-to-face. Okay, without more ado, next is Justin Wiegand talking about Misfit Matters. That'll be very interesting for all us misfits.
Right. All right, let's see if I can share my screen quick.
Oh, Ting, can you unshare your screen?
Yeah, it might not let me yet. Okay.
Okay, great. I think we're ready for you to share your screen.
Fantastic. Okay, so I just switched to a new computer. I'm gonna have to actually quit real quick because I'm allowing my permissions to take screen sharing. I'll be right back on.
If he's more than a minute here, we'll just go to Andrew next. Why don't we go ahead and start with Andrew? I don't want to delay things too much. I want to leave some time at the end.
Sure,
So
sure.
We'll just put off Justin.
Okay. All right. So I'm Andrew Weaver. I'm going to talk to you today about skill demands and time to hire, hiring frictions. And so what's the issue here? We have a lot of complaints from firms that they can't find the skilled workers that they're looking for. And these claims persist through kind of the ups and downs of the business cycle. And in particular, there are a lot of assertions about STEM skills and inadequate STEM skills. A common story is technical changes have hit industries, skill demand spiked, workers never got the memo, they needed to study more computer programming. Hiring problems are concentrated around these technical skill demands and high-tech establishments, and these problems grow, these kind of structural problems grow worse as a tighter labor market. This is going to be based on pre-COVID data, exacerbates existing skill deficiencies. And the question is, does the evidence support this view? And this leads to the question of what do we know about skills in hiring? And it turns out not as much as we would like. There's no US government survey that tracks detailed employer skill demands and hiring outcomes, particularly at the kind of firm or establishment level. Academics have tried to get at this question through a variety of methodologies. One is to kind of estimate the total supply and demand of skills in the labor market. This is problematic because we don't have direct measures of, say, the total demand for skills in the labor market. And these methods end up using proxies like educational attainment on both sides of the equation to represent both supply and demand. And small changes in assumptions end up resulting in very large swings in estimated gaps or surpluses. A more promising method involves looking for an equilibrium indicator like wages or vacancies, and testing for signs of some kind of imbalance or friction. This would be like spiking wages, indicating demand is outstripping supply for particular skills. That's a very, very worthwhile line of analysis. However, as I don't need to remind this audience in particular, there are a lot of reasons why wages move other than just supply and demand. There are inter-industry inter-industry wage differentials. There are decline of unions, eroding real value of minimum wages. And these methodologies still have no direct measure of skills. There are a few vacancy papers, such as Weaver and Osterman in 2017, that do have detailed skill measures, but the data from that paper in particular were cross-sectional, so we have to be a little cautious about the results. More recently, researchers have turned to online job ads, things like Burning Glass. This has been tremendously helpful for longitudinal tracking of detailed skill demands, but there's a critical, lack or, oversight in the lack of hiring outcomes for particular jobs or particular employers. When we see a job ad, we don't know, was that job ever filled? Was that an unfilled vacancy? How long did it take? We don't have that information. And to the extent there is any evidence on this type of thing, and a few years ago, Jason Faberman and Xinguo published an article where they did get at a little bit of this, but using data from 1980 to 1982. So there really in a long time has not been the ability to pair detailed skill demands with a measure of time to hire and vacancy duration that is longitudinal. So because of this gap into this void, a lot of trade associations and politicians and pundits have jumped in with all kinds of assertions, generally non-factual assertions about skills gaps and what have you. So we're going to see if we can correct a little bit or add a little more empirical evidence to this situation. In general, we'd like to know, is it more difficult to hire skilled workers? And if so, how much? It's key to note there's a tricky measurement issue here. It takes longer to hire a CEO than a janitor, but few people are going to say, well, gee, that implies that there's an enormous, or critical shortage or a skills gap for CEOs in America. So, you've got to address that issue. And this leads to our approach. We're going to use, and I should have stated up front, this is research I'm jointly doing with Hejin Rowe, who is soon to be at Michigan State. Our approach is to use unique job level data on skill requirements and time to hire, vacancy duration for temporary staffing workers. So this is going to be contingent worker data from a national vendor management system. More on that in a second. And instead of just kind of lumping everything together and trying to, interpret kind of hard to interpret aggregates, we're going to investigate in particular the difference in time to hire between software developers, we all know what that is, and administrative assistants. And this is kind of analogous to a diff and diff approach. So, we expect it's going to take longer to hire a software developer than an administrative assistant. The question is, how does that gap vary with items of interest like region, time, and differing skill demands? What predicts the narrowing or widening of that gap? So that's going to be our approach. We get the data from, we'll call it Applicant Tracking Company, an HR staffing consulting company in the US. It has, kind of unique vendor management data on firm use of temporary workforce, temporary workers, both firm and job level data. It's drawn from 49, Fortune 500 firms over 2012 to 2017. This covers about 200,000 jobs for which there are about 1 million applicants. About 41% of those were ultimately successfully hired into those positions. And it's worth noting, these are kind of real job descriptions that are internally communicated from the firm, the hiring firm, to the temporary staffing firms that are going to fill these positions. They're not just job ads. In other words, they're not being charged by the word and limited to a certain number of words based on the outlet where this is being published. These are the firm's communications of requirements. In terms of how we coded skills for analytical skills and reading and writing and quantitative skills, we followed the literature, drew some things from ONET, some things from prior publications. I'll show a chart in a second. For technical skills, we took a little more inductive approach. We identified the 300 most common nouns and proper nouns using some machine learning techniques. And we tagged 2 types of technical skills. One is specific software requirements, Java, C++, Python, and the other were general technical terms, program, application, interface, that imply a somewhat more technical, kind of job regime. We used a bag of word, kind of word count approach to code a job description for the number of skill requirements in a given category. And then we standardized that, so these are measured in standard deviations. All of our subsequent specifications control for total word count, so we're not kind of rewarding particularly wordy ads. These are just some of the various skill terms that went into the given different cognitive skill, soft skill, and technical skill categories. And this is our empirical specification where log time to hire is our dependent variable. We're going to control for a number of occupational, regional, and time differences. As it's a difference in different specification, it's going to be the interaction effects that yield the coefficients of interest, the effects of interest. And I'm going to blow by a little bit the, in the interest of time, descriptive statistics. And these are the results, which I am also, in the interest of time, going to shamelessly summarize, but I'll kind of slowly slip through we have interactions between region and software developer. Again, this is getting at the question of how does the gap in hiring time between a software developer and a admin assistant vary by region? Is it bigger in some regions, smaller in other regions? How does that gap vary over time? So over time, how has this gap evolved? And how does that gap evolve based on the nature of the skill requirements from a particular job ad at a particular firm? And again, the results here are at the firm level or at the job ad level. So as expected, turns out software developer positions take longer to fill than admin assistant positions. The key question is, how does that gap vary? By region, it turns out the West is significantly faster, has a smaller gap. At some level, this is an expected result based on the agglomeration of technical talent in the West. You'd expect more ready availability of software developers. Surprisingly, it turns out the Midwest also has significantly faster gap between software developer and admin assistant, significantly smaller. And there's a policy implication for this, which is just increasing the supply of computer technical skills is not, to the extent you look around the Midwest, is not necessarily going to address economic challenges in the Midwest. The supply-demand balance, at least in the temporary staffing market, is already relatively favorable in the Midwest, and that kind of points towards paying attention to technical skill demand rather than just quality of supply in pursuing various economic development strategies. From a time perspective, the results show the gap between software development and administrative assistance does not grow worse as the labor market tightens. This is the opposite of what you would expect. In fact, the gap grows significantly smaller in 2016 and 17. And at some level, this implies that technical labor supply in the US is responsive. There is an elastic response here. It's not the case that there's kind of a inelastic supply of technical talent driven by underlying structural problems that just prevent supply response to growing demand. This shows some responsiveness, significant responsiveness. And finally, on the skills front, interpersonal, soft, and reading, writing skills are all associated with a smaller rather than a larger gap. So these are not associated with greater hiring difficulties for, technical software development positions relative to admin assistant positions. Quantitative skills turn out to have no significant or large relationship with these hiring gaps. The technical skill effects are very interesting. They're bifurcated. The specific software requirements, Java, C++, XML, are associated with a smaller differential. The more of those skills that a particular job ad demands, the smaller the differential in hiring time between software developers and admin assistants. On the other hand, general kind of technical terms, program, application, interface, what have you, the more of those you have, that's associated with a greater gap. So I'd argue these technical results are pretty surprising and nuanced. First, they point to the importance of not just lumping all technical skills together and creating some kind of big, just definitely not a cognitive skill index, but even a technical skill index. There are really different dynamics going on with differently precisely measured skills. And they also it may point to a different way of thinking about skill requirements and hiring challenges. It may not be the level of skills that's important, but whether the requirements are standardized and easily communicated, like specific software skills, or whether they relate to kind of harder to articulate analytical or conceptual requirements. So this is early research. These results are literally hot off the press as of yesterday. So we're still going to be exploring how to think about these general technical requirements. But taken together, the results cast a lot of doubt on very simplistic skills gap stories, and they point towards the importance of both demand and a nuanced understanding of skill requirements, as opposed to just laying all difficulties at the door of inadequate, deficient labor supply. And finally, next steps, we can explore other occupations in this data. There's a lot more we can do with machine learning methods that we're exploring. We're exploring new versus old skills. Does it matter whether the computer programs are 20 years old or 2 years old? And there also is data on regular workers in addition to contingent data. That data is a little less complete and doesn't have wage controls and what have you. So we've started with the contingent workers, but that is the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Very interesting, really interesting. Without further ado, we'll go on to Justin. Are you back, Justin?
Yes, I am. Sorry for the hassle. Had a new computer and the Zoom permissions weren't set up yet on a Mac, so had to go back up. Anyway, yeah, great to be with you all virtually today. Thanks, Ting and Andrew. I'm going to be covering an empirical paper that was completed with Fritz, Drasgow, and Jim Rounds, where we sought to understand how the match or the mismatch between individuals' interests and then the interest characteristic of their work environments relate to job satisfaction. All right, so the idea here that's kind of existed for some time in the interest literature is pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and I'd argue it's intuitive. It's that interest fit. When you have a fit between your own interests and then the kind of interests that characterize your work environment, that should have a positive impact on job satisfaction, right? So, the founders of modern interest theory certainly thought so. All these quotes are from some of the luminaries in this field. And, kind of more than almost anything, they held that just this, fit should positively relate to job satisfaction. However, there's been 3 meta-analyses that have come out looking at overall job satisfaction and interest fit, and 3 of 3 failed to support this foundational claim. So, we could just kind of end it there, conclude the meta-analyses are correct, and no relationship exists. But we believe there are some compelling methodological and theoretical reasons why kind of that simplistic fit equals job satisfaction hypothesis is worth revisiting. All right, so I'll get into those, but first let's kind of take a moment to define vocational interests and interest fit. I know most of us maybe in the virtual room here are economists, but we're coming from a distinctly industrial organizational kind of psychology perspective here. So like most in this area, we conceptualize interests using Holland's RIASEC model. 6 interests exist, and they're characteristic of both person and environment. And together, these 6 interests form the acronym RIASEC. All right, broadly defined, these 6 interests are realistic, which is kind of hands-on mechanical kinds of work. Investigative, which would be representative of probably many of our primary interests. That's going to be science, research, scholarship, the STEM fields in general. Artistic is just what you think of. It's representative of work in the arts. Social is characterized by helping people and teaching others, especially elementary school, junior high school, kind of early teaching. Enterprising is characterized by influencing others and in sales kinds of roles, aspects of leadership roles. And then finally, conventional interest is representative of record keeping and kind of very clearly defined systematic data tasks. All right. It's also worth noting, apart from these 6 interests, that they all operate on a continuum. So we all have some level of each interest, as do work environments, right? We might talk about, our primary interest as being most representative of us. But in fact, we could rate each of these interests for each person and each work environment. And of course, because they operate both for person and environment, we can compare those 2 components for fit and misfit. Right? Now, finally, I'll just note that the structure of the 6 RIASEC interests is not a simple structure. They are related such that adjacent interests, like realistic and investigative, are going to generally have higher correlations than alternate interests, which will have higher correlations than opposing interests. So that's kind of the reason for the hexagon or the circular structure of interests. All right, so with that aside, why revisit fit and job satisfaction, right? Were those meta-analyses correct, or is there a reason to kind of go back to the drawing board a bit? Well, of first importance is the methodological issue. So past interest fit studies that these meta-analyses looked at collapsed 2 unique variables, specifically the person and the environment, into 1 variable. So often this was just by using a difference score. You could take the person minus the environment squared, just person minus environment, forget the square if you want. But in many cases, they were just looking at a squared difference score. And in some other cases, they were looking at other single index kind of one-off congruence indices specific to this RIASEC model of interest. The problems with these kinds of single index measures have been thoroughly outlined, and I'm not going to really rehash them here. But Jeff Edwards and his colleagues have kind of spent a large portion of a kind of illustrious career defining all of the issues here. And at a high level, these single index measures force misfit relationships to be symmetric. So when environmental scores exceed or fail to meet a person's interest scores, outcomes are mathematically constrained to operate in the same way. Right, so we can't actually look at non-symmetric relationships where maybe environmental excess, if the environmental score exceeds the person, operates different than if the environmental score fails to meet the person's interest. So this whole idea of differential kind of misfit effects is overlooked. And in fact, measurement error, if those effects exist in the data, measurement error is just inherently introduced, which might lead to non-significant findings, like in these meta-analyses, right? The problem is kind of similar to using ordinary least squares regression, for an analysis, and you conclude that there's no meaningful relationship, when in fact a curvilinear relationship exists, but you didn't add the polynomial term. And so, you're just using the wrong method for the data. All right, so that's kind of the methodological concern. And apart from that, there's a general lack of theorizing around misfit asymmetry in the first place. We really don't know how misfits behave, right? Do they differentiate between environmental excess and deficiency, like I was just kind of alluding to? Do they operate the same way when they experience misfit across these different RIA-Sec interests, right? There's 6 different interests. And are there differences between fit when the component measures are both low versus both high, right? You can have a low score on a given interest and your environment can be low, and that's fit. You can have a high score on an interest and the environment can be high. That's also fit. So what about those kind of low to high fit relationships? All of these questions have been overlooked and really unaddressed with past measurement models. All right, so to develop a framework for interest fit and job satisfaction that can account for possible asymmetry, and so we can kind of talk about that intelligently, we turned to needs supplies fit. This is a type of complementary fit that's well suited to explaining asymmetries. And interests really fall within the definitions of both needs and supplies. So it's not much of a stretch to place interest within this theoretical framework. First off, interest exists for both person and environment. And for individuals, they're defined as kind of the innate and learned requirements for certain kinds of work and activity. And that fits the definition of needs. Needs require context, which work environments provide. All right, so we're not the first to kind of actually suggest that needs supplies fit is a good conceptualization for interests. Van Eyck and colleagues kind of established that in 2011, but it just hasn't been applied broadly, and it hasn't really been thought out with regard to misfit asymmetry between different kinds of misfit and job satisfaction. All right, so once we're kind of working within needs supplies fit, we can develop a framework for misfit asymmetry among interests. So I'll just kind of orient you to this plot real quick. So the vertical axis here would be job satisfaction, right, low to high. And then the horizontal axis is just meant to conceptualize the variety of fit and misfit relationships that might exist. So fit here is in the middle. When the person and the environment are the same, you have a difference of 0 if we were to kind of look at a difference score here. And then as the environment fails to meet the person, increasingly so, you would move towards the left side of the plot. That's environmental deficiency. And then as the environment would provide more of an interest than kind of somebody might demand or need, we would see excess in this right side of the plot, environmental excess, right? Need supplies fit starts out simple enough. The theory suggests that a positive outcome like job satisfaction will rise as supplies meet needs, right? There's not a lot of question that as your needs are met, you would expect a positive outcome like satisfaction to increase. So we're going to follow need supplies fit, basic tenet there, and say that, as we move from deficiency to fit, you'd expect job satisfaction to rise. Now, when we move into environmental excess, the environment providing more of a given kind of interest than what somebody might say they need, we might, have more trouble, right, defining how this would look. And there's at least 3 ways this could operate. The first would be to kind of have an asymptotic relationship characterized by letter A here, where environmental excess doesn't really impact positively or negatively job satisfaction. We could have a monotonic relationship where in fact excess is kind of rewarding and invigorating or motivating. And perhaps you'd see satisfaction increase like letter B. And then of course, job satisfaction could decrease. And again, this is what most of the past interest studies have kind of inherently tested, whether they intended to or not. And this would be letter C. Okay, among other things, we suggest in our paper that the environmental point of comparison is really key to understanding what happens under environmental excess, right? If we think back of those kind of 3 types of relationships. So when we compare individual scores to objective environmental scores, such as expert ratings or the average interests of incumbents in a given occupation, there's an explicit comparison that's made between individuals, an explicit comparison between individuals' needs and their perceived supplies is not made, right? They're not actually, the respondent is only saying, hey, here's my interest. They're not saying what they perceive their environment to actually be. And so individuals' interest needs are being compared to an independently formed measure of interest strength. And in these cases, we would say that, look, the motivating nature of interest, which has really been well established across studies, that it would really be the driving force here. Now, higher interest environments would in fact kind of activate workers through the motivating components of interest to experience more job satisfaction than they otherwise would have. Right? So with objective environmental scores, respondents do not directly perceive kind of interference between maybe their interests and the interests of their environment. So again, we expect that motivating nature of interest to kind of rule the day. But if we were to have respondents rate their interests as well as their environment on the exact same kind of a scale, a commensurate scale, where you know, they're having to directly consider the way that their interests match up and kind of map onto their work environment, we would expect discrepancy theories to kind of drive this relationship. And these kind of emphasize that when we have a cognitive comparison between what we say we need and then what we actually experience, and we're directly looking at those things, job satisfaction is only optimized when the discrepancy is minimized. So at the point of fit, we would expect job satisfaction to be optimized. And in either kind of form of misfit, as we move towards deficiency or environmental excess, we would expect to see job satisfaction decrease. All right, so just a quick summary of our misfit hypotheses under both fit approaches. Under the objective environmental kind of scoring, we would expect to see a monotonic relationship where, at least to some extent, job satisfaction continues to rise into the area of environmental excess. And then for the subjective environment, we would expect an upside down U-shaped relationship, like letter C here. All right, we've considered misfit. Well, what about fit? Just real quick, this is a little more straightforward. You know, recall the motivating nature of interests. When misfit is not in question, we would expect job satisfaction to increase as the level of an interest increases. All right, so when applied to fit, it's important to know fit is not a specific point, it's actually a line, right? You could have a low person environment, high person environment, you know, moderate, etc. So as we look across that line of fit, we would expect to see job satisfaction increase from low to high values of the component person and environment variables. All right. We also ask a research question here. There wasn't a lot to kind of think about theoretically as we dove into this, but we certainly were interested, since we were able to test each of the REASEC interests uniquely. We're interested in this idea, does misfit relate to job satisfaction differently across the 6 interests as well? So in many cases, when these single index fit scores were used, they actually collapsed not only person and environment together, but also all 6 of the REASEC interests together, right? So we're starting to tease apart a lot of these different components. We evaluated our hypotheses and the research question using 2 different studies. One evaluated objective fit, and then the second study looked at subjective fit. Both used large cross-sectional crowdsourced samples using Amazon MTurk. All right, so our first sample collected via Amazon MTurk, we evaluated person interest and job satisfaction with established validated scales, and then we formed environmental profiles for individuals' occupations by first coding the self-reported job title that a respondent gave us to ONET, and then kind of grouping on ONET occupations, we formed occupational interest profile by averaging everyone in that occupation. We actually did leave one out, aggregation, so we left out the individual respondent on each kind of calculation of the average, so we wouldn't inflate the correspondence between the person and their environment. 2 minutes? Okay. Okay, yep, so if we look at our misfit hypotheses, just real quick, we're gonna have to go quite fast. But we found support for our hypothesis for investigative and artistic interest. Essentially, there was an increase in job satisfaction from deficiency all the way into excess. We found an opposite form of asymmetry, not anticipated, for enterprising and conventional interest. And then for realistic and social, the other 2, we found that there really wasn't any difference between the 2 forms of asymmetry, the 2 forms of misfit. So interestingly, there was actually 3 different ways, 3 different sets of responses that we found across these 6 interests. And again, oftentimes these have all been collapsed into a single measure. Now, if we look at subjective interest fit, here we did find in all cases, if you look at A4, this is the curvature of the misfit line. In all cases, there was an upside down U-shaped relationship, which is the negative value here for the curvature. I'm just kind of skipping over our fit relationships altogether because they're maybe a little less interesting. So just to show you visually, this negative curvature, what you see here from left to right on each of these plots is really the representation of misfit. So fits in the middle here, going from the foreground to the background. As we moved away from that in either direction, for our subjective fit results, we saw a decrease in job satisfaction. And again, if we look at these plots for the objective fit results, you'd see that in some cases, there was just an increase going from deficiency to excess. And then in some cases, the opposite was true, right? It was dependent on interest. For sake of time, I'm going to just allude to the fact that some interesting takeaways here was that when we look at the differences between interests, we find some kind of real categorical differences between the interests that generally elevated excess, job satisfaction for excess, and then the interests that generally saw job satisfaction decrease in the area of excess. And that goes along the lines of kind of some of the motivating aspects of the work, whether the work dealt with kind of creative ideation types of tasks or more routine tasks. We also noted that for investigative interests, we saw in both cases, even with the subjective results, that excess led to an increase in job satisfaction. And for this, I think it's very interesting to note that there might be some underreporting going on where individuals aren't always aware of the STEM field and all that it might offer them. And so there's socialization away from the STEM field that's been well documented for females. And so it might be that, look, we see folks underreporting their interest here. They don't realize how much they would actually enjoy investigative work. And so this is kind of showing up as excess, leading to a higher level of job satisfaction, when in fact, people just aren't reporting how high their level of investigative interest even is. In fact, we teach this apart in a separate paper that just got accepted at the Journal of Career Assessment. And so there's a whole nother story there. I'm gonna skip over maybe the rest and wrap up, but welcome questions, and thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. These are three very interesting papers. I appreciate you guys presenting them in a very efficient way. Of course, we're left with only, 6 minutes for questions, but hopefully we can get in a couple of questions. I have a couple of questions I could ask, but I'd rather open it up to the audience and see if there are any questions out there. If you have a question, perhaps you can raise your hand. I'm not an expert on these technologies, but I think I can detect whether there are hands raised.
Justin, can you stop? Oh, there. The screen sharing?
Yes. Sorry, let me make sure that, is it off? Maybe not. Here we go, stop share. There we go.
Okay, I don't see any hands raised yet, so let me ask a question of Ting. Why would we expect ICT to complement non-cognitive skills? Someone's courteous. Is the value of courteousness improved if you have access to ICT? We can all make jokes, of course, about how non-courteous people can be on the internet, but I'm quite interested in this. You found that
Right.
for females, the value of non-cognitive skills was 0 if they didn't have ICT, but positive if they did.
Right. I think the idea is when we look at the wages and how people interact with people. So we tend to see new technology may help those people also advance our communication styles and efficiency of working with others, because many works now it has to be teamwork or cooperative work. It's not like an individual, you just crunch data or doing separate from others. I think they can help to create a more more efficient, effective work kind of relationship, workplace. And I think that's how these non-cognitive skills brought up in our research context or practical environment. Even for literature talk about even for the mutual fund managers, right? Analysis in the Wall Street, we see the social skills is more relevant nowadays, probably compared to before. Also answer a quick response to in the chat box. There's a question for me. How to tease out the effect that ICT high cognitive people tend to use ICT more often because they are doing better jobs. I think I said that before, and is that both conceptual and also technical. We run some a two-stage methods, try to tease out ICT use, using instrument variables. So the effect is still mostly consistent, but a little bit weakened. So that's what we found using two-stage model to try to test out that. And also like a little bit, backup, for the sample. The total sample is like this. The average education is less than 10 years, it's 9 point something. So it's from a junior high to high school education for most of the interviewees. And also the average income is about 24,000 Chinese yuan. So it's like about 3,000 US dollars for, that's the annual. It kind of like a very, it's not like those are high-tech people, doing these, high profile jobs. So that's kind of the, kind of put this on a more like a baseline, kind of condition to look at how these technology and abilities interact.
Okay.
Right.
I don't see other hands up right now, so I will ask another question of Andrew. This is really interesting stuff. As you say, employers are often complaining they don't have the skills they need. Well, one response might be, hey, you can provide those skills to employees. And I don't know how that fits into your model, but it would be interesting to look at where there are skill gaps, where it's difficult to attract a software developer. Are employers more likely to teach, C++ or whatever? I don't know. How could that figure into your method or analysis?
Yeah, I would love to have training as well by, at the, the job ad firm level. How much training for this occupation does that establishment provide? We don't have that. It's an interesting question. As the training data is basically not collected in the US. So I would love to do something more with training. And if anybody has any ideas on how to integrate this with some training data set, I'm all ears.
Yeah. Good. Any other comments? We're actually technically at the end of the time, and I was told we were supposed to be run a tight ship here. So, but are there any last comments people would like to make?
I just like to point out that there are questions in the chat box.
Okay. Yes, I was monitoring that, and I just, okay. Why don't we go ahead and take a couple of those? I was missing those last couple of questions.
It looks like the main question is for Justin about whether he looked at any outcomes other than job satisfaction. Justin?
Yeah, and I respond to that. Just, current data collection is going on right now where we're looking at job performance, and that's, we're also looking at some control variables and things like that. But job performance is the next DV.
Okay, good.
I have a question, if time is okay.
Sure, what the heck?
Okay, the question's on is for Andrew, and your findings very interesting, definitely very relevant research. I very much enjoyed it. You mentioned that the time to hire, you find shorter for some software jobs, and kind of wondering whether that's also related to a lot of the software or computer field jobs have a higher urgency to hire. A lot of those contracts has very time sensitive. And if you, a couple of weeks or months later, it's not really needed anymore. So they have to speed up instead of janitor, it's okay if they have a lot of supply anyhow, and that's not that urgent in a sense. So I'm wondering how that's factored, because it looks like you did not have the variable capture. You might have the data. And also you mentioned that Midwest happened to have the, very interesting, faster hiring. So kind of wondering whether you have some, possible reasons for that. Also the data source, is that possible because the data source, the company you used maybe somewhat related to Midwest? I'm not sure, I'm just curious.
Yeah. So on the first, in terms of software jobs may be more pressing kind of contract work that needs to be done right away. That may well be true, but remember that's part of the rationale for using this difference in difference, where there's a baseline difference between administrative assistant and software developer. And, you know, at some level, the idea is to absorb any, you know, to the extent software related jobs tend to be more, you know, pressing contractual jobs. It's trying to, you know, absorb that into the baseline difference and then look at how this varies across, you know, factors of interest. And in terms of the Midwest, it's a good question. I think, you know, there's a different supply demand situations in each region. Before having other information, my first hypothesis would be, you know, the Midwest does a not terrible job of supplying technical skill relative to the demand that's out there. And to the extent people want to see more technical, higher paying, higher productivity jobs, they have to think a little about stimulating demand for those occupations, not just kind of supply side initiatives, because, you know, supply is not so bad at this point. The Midwest universities and community colleges are maybe not doing such a bad job.
Great. I think we're several minutes over now, so we should wrap it up. But I found these papers really interesting. I really did, and could engage more conversation with you guys quite a bit. But let's wrap it up for now, and let's get to the get ready for the virtual happy hour.
Thanks a lot, Doug.
Okay.
Yep, thanks, Doug.
Thank you all.